I get nervous every time I go to drive this project car. Seems like every time I drive it, something else goes wrong. And every time that happens, I have this little voice in the back of my head telling me that next time something goes wrong, it's gonna be something major instead of something minor. The engine swap I did into this thing was pretty stupid. It took rebuilding every single part of this car in order to support this giant turbo diesel I shoved in here. I had to put in bigger axles, I had to reinforce the frame, I had to modify every single bit of this thing to make this drivetrain work. And when you do that, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. The first time that I took this thing out and drove it, I was hearing what I thought sounded a lot like gear noise. Yeah, I'm getting a lot of gear noise out of the transmission. But when I got it home, I checked underneath it and it looked like the transmission had just been running into the body. So with a little bit of cutting, I thought I had fixed that problem. But then I drove it down the hill to the gas station in order to put some diesel in it. And driving back up the hill, I had a bit of a problem. While driving up the hill, the thing started to lose power, and then eventually the engine just completely stalled out. Not only that, but just in general, this thing did not have as much power as you would expect from the giant turbo diesel engine that I put into it. This Cummins should have had a lot more power than it felt like it had. So it was pretty obvious there was something wrong with the fueling in this swap. In order to troubleshoot the fuel system, I designed this Arduino-based electronic dashboard which can measure the fuel pressure. So what I needed to do was take it out for a drive and then watch this fuel pressure in order to see if I could troubleshoot what was happening. Now the problem was, in order to get this thing out of my crowded driveway, I have to make like a 15-point Austin Powers style turn. And the power steering on this wasn't quite working right. So in order to take it for a test drive to troubleshoot the fuel system, I needed to fix the power steering. For some reason, every time I pulled this thing in and turned the key off, it would puke a bunch of power steering fluid out of the reservoir, and then there'd be a bunch of air in the system and the power steering wouldn't work anymore. In my experience, normally leaks happen when the thing's running. Usually you don't get a leak right when you turn the key off, so it was pretty weird to me that it was puking out fluid. I looked into this a little more, and what I'm pretty sure was happening was that when there was air in the system, and then you have hydraulic pressure pushing on that air was acting like a spring and compressing. But then, as soon as I turned the key off, well, the air pushes back, it's like a spring, and then it dumps all the fluid out of the reservoir. So really what the issue was is I just had air in the power steering and I needed to get rid of it. Bleeding air out of a power steering system shouldn't be that hard. I've done it a lot of times in the past, but for some reason this one was being a real pain in the butt. I figured the reason that this thing was being a pain was that I had installed a power steering cooler in it. Well, I say power steering cooler, in actuality it was a transmission cooler that I repurposed for a power steering cooler because I don't have an auto trans in this anymore and I don't need the trans cooler. So I unbolted it and then pulled it down so that it'd be a low point in the system and tried to bleed it that way, and that didn't seem to make any difference. So I got to Googling, and it turns out that the 78 Bronco power steering gearbox I have in this thing, they are notoriously hard to bleed. The issue is that the power steering lines are sitting on the side of the box, and so there's always an air bubble in the top of the box that you can't really bleed out because the power steering lines are underneath it. I wish I had known that when I put the box in, but realistically, I would have never had a choice anyways. In order to fit the Cummins, I had to put the steering gearbox on the outside of the frame, and that meant that I didn't have a lot of choices in steering gearboxes. I found Ford's factory bleeding procedure on the 78 Bronco, and it consists of turning the steering wheel a whole bunch with the engine off in order to get most of the air out, and then running the engine to get the last little bit out. So I jacked up the passenger side super high to see if I could get the air bubble out of the box, and then with the engine off, I rotated the steering a bunch. This took me about 2 hours of bleeding in order to get all of the air out of it, but I did eventually get all the air out. Next was to start the engine in order to try and bleed the last little bit out with the engine running. Except the engine wouldn't start. Apparently the fueling issue is getting even worse than it used to be because now with the front end of the car jacked up, I can't even get the thing to start. So I let the front end down and then I got under it in order to try to prime the diesel fuel system, and I found a little issue on the lift pump. There was a bunch of diesel leaking straight out of the priming knob. So eureka, I thought. This must be the problem. I have a leak in my diesel fuel system. This is probably why the thing's not working. The engine isn't gonna run if there's a leak that's allowing air to come in and ruin the prime on it. So great, I just need to order a new lift pump. So I ordered a new pump, but it turns out that mechanical lift pumps are a bit of a rabbit hole all their own. I ordered a pump that claimed it would flow better than stock, But when it got here, I took it apart in order to verify this, and the piston that was in the pump was only 26 millimeter in diameter. The stock pump had a 30 millimeter piston. So there was no way this aftermarket pump was gonna flow as much fuel as the stock pump was gonna flow. There were some good things about the aftermarket pump, like it had a few O-rings on the prime knob that the stock pump didn't have. That should help with leaking a little bit, but it needs to flow as much fuel as the stock pump. That's kind of a requirement. As near as I can figure out, it seems like these aftermarket lift pump manufacturers are just buying 4-cylinder Cummins lift pumps and selling them as if they're 6-cylinder Cummins lift pumps. So be careful when you're buying your pump and make sure to measure your piston diameter to make sure you get the right one. I ended up just robbing all the good parts out of the new pump and putting them back in the old pump. That way I figured I'd get the best of both worlds. It was the least likely to leak, but it also would have the 30 millimeter piston I needed it to have. The only other part I needed to buy was the gasket on the knob, since that bore was a slightly different size on the old pump. I'll put a link in the description if you need this gasket as well. And the other thing I would buy while I was at it is studs for the lift pump. You kind of have to compress the knob on the lift pump in order to get it in, and it's a huge pain with bolts. Studs make it a lot easier and make it a lot less likely to break something. Since I had all of this apart, there was one other small modification I needed to make. Stock, these things come with a little fuel heater that feeds the lift pump, and they're known for letting air in. I figured while I had everything apart, I wanted to remove as many points of failure as possible, so I deleted the stock fuel heater. Now, you might be surprised considering my entire last video was spent putting grid heaters in it so it would run better in the cold, and now I'm deleting the fuel heater, which is meant to make it run better in the cold. But my reasoning is that the fuel heater is really only there to prevent diesel gelling. In a place like Idaho, our winter diesel blend has anti-gelling stuff in it anyways. I don't think gelling is going to be an issue for me, but what is an issue is air leaks, so I just want to remove as many points of failure as possible. Now, the only issue with deleting that fuel heater is that there was also a little strainer in it, which makes sure that no gunk gets into the lift pump. So I needed to add a strainer on the suction side of the lift pump. Now keep in mind I'm saying strainer here, not filter. A filter takes a lot of pressure to push fluid through it, and the finer the filter, the more pressure it takes. But on the suction side of the lift pump, it's really low pressure. There's not a lot of pressure to spare for shoving fluid through a filter. So you don't want a fine filter on the suction side. You want a strainer. The filter goes on the pressure side. I found a little strainer on Amazon. It has a stainless steel mesh inside of it, and it has a pretty big volume, which means that it'll block a lot of crap before you have to clean it out, and then it comes apart so that you can clean it out. On top of that, it has AN fittings on either side, which matches with what I already got, so this was a no-brainer. I installed this strainer, and that was Fuel System Mods complete. Let's see if I fix this thing. So I started the thing, I pulled out of my garage, and I started my whole Austin Powers 15-point turn, and at one point, the steering wheel violently ripped itself out of my hand. I immediately shut the engine off to see what the hell just happened, and when I got out to look at the car, there was a giant puddle of power steering fluid underneath it. I got under there with a flashlight, and it turns out the pressure hose for the power steering had exploded. Yeah, that's right. I spent 2 hours bleeding it, and then immediately the hose came apart, which ruined all that 2 hours of work. At first I thought maybe I just installed the rubber hose wrong and the fitting came apart, but it wasn't the fitting's fault. If you look at the hose, the steel braiding on the inside is ripped apart, so the hose itself failed, it wasn't the fitting. So it turns out that a Cummins power steering pump puts out a lot of pressure, like something on the order of 1500 PSI. That's way more than I realized it put out. So I took out the rubber hose and I replaced it with a PTFE or Teflon stainless steel braided one. This PTFE hose is built for way higher pressures and it should actually work here. If you're doing AN stuff on power steering, I'd recommend going straight to the PTFE hoses. They're a little more expensive, but they're not that much more expensive, and apparently power steering is a lot of pressure. I got the new hose in, and this time it only took me like an hour to bleed the power steering, so I'm getting better at this. So, pulled out of the driveway. Power steering never worked better. That new hose made a really big difference. I'm super happy with that. Started driving the thing around the block, and it's dying already. I didn't even make it a full block before it died again, and I wasn't even on a hill this time. Apparently that small diesel leak on the lift pump was not the problem, and if anything, the problem just keeps getting worse and worse. So, desperate times call for desperate measures. The only remaining thing that could be the issue is that when I put this fuel system together, inside the fuel tank, I used a rubber hose as the pickup tube. Maybe what's happening is that that rubber hose is collapsing when the lift pump sucks on it, and that's what's causing my drop in fuel pressure. I'm not really sure, but everything outside the fuel tank has been replaced, so it's gotta be a problem inside the tank. It's time to drop the tank, which kinda sucks because there's 20 gallons of diesel in there. It's filled up to the brim. So, got on my back underneath the car and pulled out this 200-pound tank, lots of fun by the way, and got the pickup out. I started machining my own aluminum pickup tube because I figured the aluminum would be a lot nicer, it can't collapse, and it can be a lot more precise so that I could get it really close to the bottom of the tank so that I can suck up every drop of fuel before the fuel tank runs out and the fuel system goes dry. So I machined this nice new aluminum pickup tube, and then I went to pull the old rubber pickup tube off. But there was something wrong with it. It looked like there might be something inside of it, so I got out my hose cutters and I cut it open to see what the heck was in it. This thing was plugged full of some type of organic matter. I cut it up and looked at it, and it looks like wasp guts and maybe a nest or something. I don't know, but it was plugged full, probably a 2-inch section that was just plugged full of this organic crap. I finally found my problem. It wasn't the fact that it was rubber that was an issue, it was the fact that apparently there must have been a wasp nest or something in my tank. I don't really know how this could have happened because when I first modified the tank, I swished diesel around in it and I looked in it and I inspected it and I didn't see anything. The only thing I can think is there must have been a wasp nest on the top inside the tank, and when I filled the thing all the way full of diesel, it just started washing that crap into the bottom of the tank. I don't really know, but apparently I did not clean this tank out well enough when I installed it, and I finally found my problem. All the other things were kind of like, yeah, that could be the issue, but this one was definitely the issue. A Cummins isn't gonna run when it's sucking fuel through a 2-inch slug of wasp guts. This time, I basically spent an entire day cleaning out the tank. I violently rinsed it with diesel, I even got in there with a shop vac. I did everything I could to make sure this was perfectly clean. So here's to hoping. I got the new pickup tube installed, I got everything back together, and I got it back in the car. I went and I started up the car, and the fuel pressure was like 10 PSI higher than it used to be. That is a really big difference. So this time, I think I nailed it. I think I fixed the problem. I need to go for a drive and make sure it works. I always get so nervous trying to drive this thing. Probably because every time I do, it blows up on me in some way or another. So I figured, let's find the big hill right next to my house and let's try and drive up that. If it can make it up that, then I know that it's a lot better than it used to be. So I got outside, I drove up that hill, and it felt great. It felt so good that I figured, why would I stop at the top of the hill? Let's just keep driving. There's some curves coming up. I might as well go and test the TTB around these corners and make sure the suspension's working all right too. Well, that felt great too, so I figured, well, let's keep driving. It's a beautiful day in Idaho. It looks like there's some snow at the top of the mountains. I might as well try and get up these mountains and see if I can find any of that snow. I probably drove a total of 40 miles in this thing and there were no hiccups. It drove amazing. I couldn't believe how well this thing drives. The thing is, people hate TTB, but this thing has no sway bars and it actually handles pretty damn decent. It's lifted, it's on 37s and has no sway bars, and yeah, it'll do a curvy mountain road. At the speed limit at least. I mean, it's not like my turbo Subaru I have behind me. That thing will really carve up a mountain road, but this thing does better than you'd expect. Eventually I'll put sway bars on it and see how good it does then. This thing rides amazing. And the Cummins is working great. There's one thing that's not working so great though. I said no hiccups. Well, there was one hiccup. Remember how the first time I ever drove this, I said that I thought I heard some gear noise coming out of it, and then I figured it was just some interference? Well, I was getting that interference sound again. It sounded like something was running into something. I figured eventually it would self-clearance and it would be fine, but it didn't self-clearance, it kept getting worse. It got worse and worse until I got to the top of the mountain and finally found that snow I was talking about. And the first time I had this thing on 37s driving through slush, and it felt amazing. So as you do, I figured I'd romp the throttle a little bit, get a little bit sideways, have a little fun. These 37s just ate it up. It was awesome. Except that after I had romped the throttle in the slush like that, the noise got way worse. It was definitely gear noise. It was definitely not interference. When you get a gearbox out of some dude on Craigslist for as cheap as possible, sometimes this happens. It was making all these crazy noises. When I'm in neutral or when I'm coasting, it's making horrible noises. If I'm on the throttle, it's not actually that bad, but neutral or coasting is really bad. I think that little romp may have grenaded my transmission. So the good news is that the fuel issue is fixed. I am super excited about that. The even better news is that this thing runs and drives amazing. The bad news though is it might need a transmission. I need to get this thing apart and look at it and see what the heck happened. So if you're as antsy as I am to see what the hell happened, then subscribe and stick around. Until then, thanks for hanging out with me in my garage today. Now, get out there and build something. I hope to see you next time.